Welcome to another video on Python tutorial for beginners, and in this one we will be looking at tuple in Python. Please subscribe to the channel and click the like button if you find this video helpful. Turn on your notifications so that each time I post a new video like this one, you'll be notified to come check on it. Okay, so with that being said, let's get started, and I will first open a folder that I've already created so I can make a file that today's code will be stored in. And in order for me to do this, in fact, let me first of all show you the folder that I've created here, and as you can see, the name is called Learning Python. So I will go ahead and open this folder in my code editor. I'm using Visual Studio Code. So to do that, I will simply right click on my Visual Studio Code, click on this new empty window like this, and come to where I have this file, click on it and click on Open Folder. Select the folder that I created and click on OK. Now that the folder is open, to create a file inside it using Visual Studio Code, I will simply come to where I have this tiny plus icon and click on it and give my file a name. In my case, I will call it tuple.py. Now, any name you are giving your file is fine, but don't forget the .py extension, because it's a Python extension which will instruct your code editor to process all the code that we are going to write inside this file as Python codes. Now that we are done, let us return back to what today's video is all about, which is what is tuple. Tuple are used to store data that are not supposed to change in the lifetime of a program. So what do I mean by this? Imagine you are programming a web application and you want your users to get to choose whether they are male or whether they are female. Of course, you can go ahead and store this type of data like this, like male and female, because you already know that human beings can either be male or they can be female. Of course, you can go ahead and you see some applications, they will say something like order like this, and once you click on it, they will now say specify. But the orders is something that is very, very rare before you can find. What we normally have is either human being is a male human being or the human being is a female. So this type of data structure here, you can go ahead and store it in a tuple, because of course you don't want this type of information to change throughout the lifestyle of a program. So that's where using tuple is very, very useful. So but the next question now is, how can you identify that a certain line of code you are looking at in Python is a tuple or not? So one of the ways to identify that the line of code you are looking at in Python is a tuple is that Python always have open and close parentheses. So what do I mean open and close parentheses? This is a parenthesis, right? So tuple in Python always have this open and close parentheses like this. So once you see any data structure, any data type, any line of code that has open open parentheses and closing parentheses, and it has some element, this is elements, and it has some elements inside, and these elements are assigned to a certain name, like what you are seeing here, a certain variable, just know that you are looking at a tuple. Of course, if you have been following along with the series, we talked about list, you understand that we looked at how to assess elements. So these data that are stored inside this tuple are called elements or items. This is exactly the same name. Things that are stored inside a list in Python is also called. So even the way that you use to assess elements in a tuple is the same way you use in assessing elements in a list. So let us look at how to assess elements in a tuple. So imagine that we have this tuple of male and female, as you see. So at the meantime, I'm going to go ahead and remove that order because we don't really want it. All right, so how can you assess elements in a tuple? So one of the way that you can assess elements in a tuple is you could just go ahead, call the name of the tuple, and find the index number of the element you want to assess. Now, if you have not watched the video we talked about indexing with lists, and you are kind of confused what indexing is, I really recommend you to go back and check the video that we talk seriously on the indexing. on list. So starting from list and also in tuple, Python considers the element inside this tuple to be a zero-base indexing element. So what I mean by zero-base indexing element here is that this first element, instead of Python starting from 1 to count 1 and 2, Python is going to start from 0 to count this first element here. So this male now have an index number of 0 and female has index number of 1. So supposing we have something like this, dimension equals to let's say something like 200 and something like 400, something like 500, something like okay, let's call this one 700. All right, what is going to be the index of 200? Is going to Python is going to count 0, 1, 2 and 3. Even when you are looking at 4 elements inside here, but when Python wants to name them in terms of indexing, it is going to use zero-based indexing. So it's going to start from the first element and name it to be 0, and the second one 1, third one 2, and the fourth one 3. So I hope you understand this. Now we want to access the second element. That's the reason we are passing 1 here, and this one now we are using it to access this female. Now we can go ahead and wrap this in a print function for us to see the result in the terminal. And remember the job of print function. Print function is just simply a way of telling Python, I send the code to the terminal, I want to see the result. So each time we wrap a certain line of code on print function like this and hit on Ctrl S to save and Ctrl plus A5 for us to see the result in the terminal. And as you can see, I grab my result here in the terminal, but unfortunately my terminal screen is highly filled up. So I will just go ahead and run this again. So I can run this by clicking this tiny icon in Visual Studio Code, or you can use Ctrl plus A5 to run it and see the results in the terminal. And in my own case, as you can see, I got female here because the index number of this female is 1. If we want to access this first element, the index number here is going to change and it's going to be 0. And we have Ctrl S and Ctrl plus A5 to see the result here in the terminal. You can see we have male. Okay, one thing I want to point your attention is that it's very nice to have this terminal open at the bottom side of the code editor. But what if you want to open this terminal and you want to open it side by side? You want this other side for you to write down your codes and see the result in this side. So if that's what you want, you can go ahead, move your mouse cursor to where you have this terminal, right click on it and click on move panel right, and immediately you click on that move panel right, you see your terminal is gonna open by the right hand side of it. So I kind of like to collapse this side by inside so that I can have some space. Now let us also look at some other properties of understanding and detecting a tuple. So we already said that tuple always start with parentheses. Another thing that you also need to take note is that the last element in a tuple always end with a comma. It doesn't matter even if you have one single element inside a tuple, but as long as it's an element and it's a tuple that you are defining, it must have an ending comma like this. If you don't put the ending comma, Python might not necessarily throw you an error, but at least with the conventions of Python here, you should be ending your tuple, the elements inside your tuple, with an ending comma. Okay, another thing you also need to understand about tuple is that once we define elements inside this tuple here, like in this case we have male and female, you can never change the elements that is inside a tuple already. You can't change it. You can modify it. In fact, if you try to change it, Python is going to throw you an error. Remember that we looked at list, and we also said that if you want to change elements in a list, you can go ahead and in this case and just say some code and give the name of the list and followed it by the index number of what you want to change, and give it a new element, give it a new value. So if you try such thing, if we try this type of thing with tuple, Python is going to throw us an error. Why? Because once you define elements, once you define items inside a tuple, which in this case is male and female, you can never change those elements again in Python. So let us go ahead and try to print this sex right now and see what Python is going to give us. As you can see here in the result in the terminal, Python is showing us an error and is saying type error. And if you looked at where the error is coming from, it's coming from line 6 from here, as you can see. And if you look at line 6, that is where we are trying to assign a new value, a new element, a new item to the element that has already existed, and in this case is this male here, because male has the index number of this 0. So Python is telling us that it's type error, tuple object does not support item assignment. That is what we are saying. You can assign a new item to a tuple even when we cannot change the elements inside this tuple. Now there is a way that we can override this tuple entirely. Now supposing is something of this nature, I love to use dimension in this particular case. So what I will simply do here is I will try to I will try to use dimension to show this particular example. So let's say that we have a tuple and the name of this tuple is dimensions, because we cannot change the value of the items inside this our dimension tuple, but we can override it. But the way that we can override it is very simple. Now in order for us to override the entire tuple, what we will simply do is we'll go ahead and get the name of this existing tuple, exactly the name of the existing tuple, and assign new values to this our tuple. Now if we do something like 400 and we said 300, we end this in comma. Of course we end this in the ending comma like this. All right, so if we print dimensions here, like print dimension, let us see. If we print dimension control plus A5, you see that when our first tuple here, which is dimensions, we have 500 and 700. That's what we define it to have. And once we printed it, you see we have 500 and 700. Okay, so right now we want to override the whole of this tuple. We want to assign new items to this tuple. So since we cannot call any of these elements out and just modify it, change it, or assign a new item to this particular tuple, now Python offers us a way of to override this tuple. And in order for you to override to this tuple, you need to completely grab the same name that you use in defining your old tuple and use that same name to define your new tuple, and now assign new values inside this your new tuple. So if we go ahead and do this and come down again to say print, and say print dimensions, as you are seeing here, if we hit control plus A5, you can see that our tuple right now possesses our new items inside. So instead of 500 and 700, this tuple has been overridden by these new values inside. As you can see, we have 400 and 300. So that is exactly the way that you can assign new items to an existing tuple. I hope that makes sense. If you are still confused, I really recommend you to come down to the comment section and drop some questions down. I will do my best to answer those. Alright, we have talked about for loop on list, so you can also use a for loop with tuple like this. Tuple cannot be an exception. And remember the work of for loop, that for loop is just a way of telling Python take up a certain line of code and run what is under it. Okay, so let us look at a way that we can use for loop with tuple. Let's assume that we still maintain this our dimensions that has the value of 400 and 700. So in order for us to use a for loop here, we can go ahead and say for dimension in dimensions, then it ends in colon like this. So once we said for dimension in dimensions, we can go ahead and print this our dimension. Of course, instead of, it's not dimension. Okay, so what we are simply doing here is we are telling Python go through our tuple here, and the name of the tuple is dimensions. So now for each value here, go ahead and remove this value from here and assign them to this new variable called dimension, and that's exactly how we can get to use this variable here. And if we hit Ctrl plus A and Ctrl plus A5, that is how we get to see the result of 400 and 300 displaying in this list. Before I end this particular video, there is something I kind of want to show you that you can still do in Python here, and it is doing some statistics with Python. So doing some statistics with Python gives us some basic functions that we can use in carry on basic statistics, and one of them is using max, another one is using mean, and sum. So the reason that I decided to pull this up is that at some point you want to add the whole numbers, you want to check the minimum number in a tuple or in a list. Sometimes you want to check the maximum number in a tuple or in a list. So let us see how we can simply use this with tuple, now that we are talking about tuple here. So let's say we get to have 10, we get to have 3, we get to have 500, and we get to have 200, we get to have 150, 700, and perhaps 630, any numbers of our choice. So if we want to use the max function here, we can go ahead and call the max function and just pass our numbers tuple here. Our tuple name here in this particular case is numbers, and that is what we are passing here. So once we pass the name here inside this our function, what we are telling this function is, okay, check this our tuple and tell us the maximum number, which number is the maximum. But in order for us to see this code, let us try to wrap it in the with print function here, so that we can see the result in the terminal. So we hit on Ctrl plus, try to clear my screen. So we hit Ctrl A and we hit on the Ctrl plus A5 to see, and immediately Python is telling us that 700 from here is the maximum number in this our tuple here. And so let us see how we can also use minimum function. So we can go ahead and just play with these things, and as you can see, Python is telling us that 3 is the minimum number here, and it's true because 3 is the smallest number among all these other elements inside our tuple. So let us see how we can use sum also. So we can go ahead and use sum the same way we have used others here. So if we just call sum and ask sum to take in the name of our tuple, so what we are telling sum here is just go ahead and add all this element that is inside this tuple and tell us the result. And immediately, as you can see, Python automatically adds the result and tell us that the result is 2193, as you have seen there. So that's something that I wanted to share with you in this particular video. If you are finding it difficult at a particular point and you are still trying to understand, I really recommend you to go to the comment section, drop your question and where you don't understand. I will do my best to come around and answer those. I hope you liked the video. Please subscribe to the channel and click that like button if you find this video helpful. Turn on your notifications so that each time I post a new video like this one, you'll be notified to come check on it. You can share this video with as many people you think might find it useful. Okay, so with that being said, I hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye.